Great. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Thank you to Anthony and to the philosopher for having us here, and to everyone out there in the audience for joining us. This is a really great crowd. As Anthony said, I'm Leah Kalmanson from the University of North Texas, and I'm so excited to be here with Bret Davis today. Bret, you're someone whose work I really admire both as a scholar and as a practitioner. And I'm so excited for the chance to talk with you some about this fantastic new book that you have out, Zen Pathways. So I wanted to start off, Bret, by giving you the chance to set the context for us all today. So give us an overview of what the book is all about, but also tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your academic training, your Buddhist training, and what all set you on the path to write this particular book.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Anthony Morgan, and the philosopher for giving us this opportunity, and also let me thank Anthony for asking Leah to do the interview. I can't think of anyone better. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. So yeah, that was a tall order, Leah. If I sketch the whole book and my whole background, we'll need many hours for that. So let me try to be as brief as possible, but I will try to sort of say something about what the character of the book, and then the harder part, sort of summarizing the 35 years or so that led up to it. So the book is my attempt to introduce what seem to be the most interesting and important topics in the philosophy and the practice of Zen. So those range from the opening chapter, where I try to situate the book in terms of how it relates to other scholarship on Zen, and so probably the opening chapter talks about a lot of the stuff we'll probably talk about today. But then I try in the second chapter, which is really the first one I wrote, and that was actually the draft of that was the demo lecture for the great courses, where I just try to say, okay, if you give me 30 minutes and I try to tell people what Zen is about, here it is. And so I try to jump right in and give a kind of preview of the path of Zen, as I call it. As a path, I draw on Dogen here as a path of studying the self, but also forgetting and ultimately opening the self. So I kind of focus on the cross-cultural theme of know thyself, and situate Zen practice and philosophy in relation to that in the second chapter. And then after that, I kind of proceed through the book's also kind of an introduction to Buddhism as well, but Buddhism from the perspective of Zen. So there's a chapter on the middle way, then the Four Noble Truths, impermanence. There's a chapter on the no self doctrine, which is complemented in Mahayana schools like Zen with the true self doctrine. And then I go into really kind of the heart of Zen, this sort of question of the one and the many, and how that personally, existentially relates to how you experience the world and how you experience yourself in relation to others. So proceeding somewhat cross-culturally and a matter of sort of interreligious as well as cross-cultural philosophical dialogue, I take up the biblical idea of loving others as yourself. What does the as mean there? And so I do some comparative work with Christianity and Zen, but also other traditions, Hindu traditions, and so forth. And then the book also then addresses sort of key Buddhist teachings such as karma, rebirth, nirvana, what the very word Buddha means, for example, a couple of chapters on that. And then also sort of perennial philosophical topics. How would Zen address these topics like language and silence? Again, the one and the many, love, language, mysticism, morality, art, nature, and so forth. So I know it sounds very ambitious, and it was very ambitious, but at some point you just have to sit down and write what you've been thinking about and practicing with for decades. And so that's what the book is. as Anthony mentioned, it stemmed from this Great Courses lectures that I did, and I probably would have never had the gumption to write such a book had it not been for the prodding of the Great Courses folks, and pushing me then also to address a wider audience than I usually do, and so audience of everyone from college students to postgraduate, lifelong learners, but maybe who don't know anything about Buddhism or anything about Zen. So how can I, sort of start without too many presuppositions and really clearly and carefully take people, also concisely, even though it's a very long book. It's divided into 24 chapters because that came from the 24 lectures. That's their format. And their timing was only 30 minutes per lecture. So I did expand that a bit in some of the chapters, so the book is longer than the lectures were. It's a rewritten and also kind of substantially added to version. But it did keep me being very sort of to the point and concise, at least more than I usually am, I guess. So the format then sort of allowed me to talk about the practice as well as the philosophy, and to just finally sort of bring those things together that up till now I'd mostly been sort of practicing in parallel to one another, commuting between the practice and philosophy. And that commuting, maybe I'll talk about in a minute, very concretely in the case of my life in Japan, where I was quite literally commuting between the university and the monastery. And so this book, I think, allowed me then to bring those different voices together, so to speak, to forge a new voice, one that certainly is academic and scholarly, but not only the academic philosopher's voice, but also the practitioner teacher's voice. From now, more than a decade and a half or so of teaching Zen in a practice context. And then also this kind of lecture format, which came out of my teaching to undergraduates in particular, and trying to sort of bring all those voices together is what I try to do in the book. I don't want to go on too long, but maybe I should say something about my personal background. I didn't get to that part yet. What do you think, Leah? Should I talk about that a little bit?
You have such an interesting background with degrees in both American and Japanese universities, and then training and certification in both academic and Zen institutional context, which I would love to share some of that. I think we have plenty of time.
Okay, so again, I'll try to give the short version. That was what I just gave you was as short as I could do for a 480-page book. So let me now do as short as I can for a 55-year life. So I was born in California, but I was raised mainly on Galveston Island, right off the coast of Texas. And I went to college in San Antonio at Trinity University. And it was there that I really, discovered philosophy right from year one. And I was a philosophy major, but I was also a religious studies minor, also an art history minor. I had two minors. But in the religious studies one, I really discovered these Asian traditions and was fascinated by them. And in fact, I had one professor in particular that I took all his classes. He taught those classes. And his wife was actually a yoga and meditation teacher. And so that's where I also began to dabble in, I would say now, practices of embodied spiritual practices of meditation and yoga. And then after college, I knew I wanted to do philosophy. I got into the philosophy program I was kind of most interested in, which is one at Vanderbilt University. And I went there. I had a very intense first year, and I loved it. I was into it. But it was all Western. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I want to do both of these things. I really want to go to Japan and to learn the language and immerse myself in the culture, and most of all to practice Zen in a traditional setting. I also wanted to practice karate in a traditional setting. So I had, what do I do here? Do I continue on the path of this academic path of philosophy, which Leah and I and several others are trying to change this, but up till now that's mostly meant Western philosophy. or do I just take off and do this totally different thing? And so I guess I took Yogi Berra's advice when he says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I took the fork in the road, and the rest of my life has been trying the best I can to do both and to commute between them, as I said. So the story is a bit colorful at that point. So I'm just a young, 22, just ambitious, think I can do everything. Of course, I have no money. So I sold my two prized possessions, which were my motorcycle and my long hair. Yeah, I got $300 for that. And bought a one-way ticket. That's all I could afford. It was a one-way ticket to Japan. I also wanted a one-way ticket because I didn't know when I was going to come back. So I went to Japan, showed up, said I'm here. Nobody seemed to care, but they let me stay. And that first stay ended up staying for about 3.5 years, and really worked on the language, and also started practicing Zen wherever would let me sit with them in various temples and monasteries. And then I did go back to Vanderbilt for 2.5 years to finish up the coursework for the PhD. But then I got a good government scholarship from Japan and went back to Japan, and this time ended up staying for about 8.5 years. And that was in Kyoto. And in Kyoto, I studied Buddhist thought, Buddhology, at Otani University. Was blown away by that. I didn't know it was so deep and wide. And then transferred. I ended up being part of the first cohort of the newly created PhD program in Japanese philosophy at Kyoto University. And then I went on to do a postdoc, and then I also taught some. So all of that, everything in Japan was all in Japanese for me. So that really, kept my language learning on a steep incline, especially the teaching. But the whole time I was doing that, I was also commuting regularly to Shokokuji Monastery. And I was doing that as a part of a lay practitioner group called Chishokai, which was formerly led by Nishitani Keiji, very famous Kyoto School philosopher, and his most important student, successor, Ueda Shizuteru, who I got to study under, both at the monastery and in academic context for many years. He recently passed away in 2019. And so my life in Japan then was mainly, especially for about a decade in Kyoto, was mainly commuting, as I say, a kind of a triangular commute between my home and Kyoto University and the monastery at Shokokuji. And they were all a short bicycle ride away apart from each other. So that's mainly what I did, is just kind of go in circles between those three. I never I did try to take the fork in the road, but as a profession, I stayed on the academic side. And so there was a kind of moment in Japan where I had to decide: do I want to become a monk and take the priestly path, or continue as a lay practitioner? And so I have lived in the monastery for shorter and sometimes longer periods of time, but I've never become a monk over there. And also then not a priest. So I guess fast forward at January 2005, I started the job moved back to the States to start the job at Loyola, and there was a Jesuit priest who was actually a Zen practitioner and led a Zen group here, Father Greg Hartley, and we were excited to work together. And unfortunately, he died of a heart attack very shortly, about a month after I arrived. He had just come to talk to my class like the day before. And so then it kind of sort of fell in my lap to recreate this group, and I had the encouragement and the authorization from Japan to teach Zen in that context. And then luckily a couple of years later, the university was remodeling a chapel. and I was still kind of a young assistant professor, but I didn't know better. So I've got some ideas for that remodel. So they were into it. We did it as a meditation chapel. So we have a Japanese-style meditation chapel that our group meets in, the Heart of Zen Meditation Group, it's called. And that group allows students in my classes, but also several other professors' classes, especially classes in Asian philosophies and religions, to do a small version of the commute that I was talking about, going back and forth between the actual practice and academic study. So they're reading text. They're kind of like the book, right? It goes back and forth between the topics of practice and philosophy. And they're really sort of doing that first person. Always optional. I always give them an option that they don't have to do that path. They can do a more traditionally academic path, or a service learning path, which is also a wonderfully experiential form of pedagogy that Loyola is very good at. And so I guess I'll stop there. That sort of catches us up to the present in this book.
Thank you for that. And I do think, I really do think your personal experiences and you kind of you as a scholar and a teacher are important in this context. That kind of leads into my next question is, and I see this book as part of this lineage of transmission of Zen to America. Predecessors of a work like this might include texts like D.T. Suzuki's Introduction to Zen Buddhism, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Shunryu, Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau. So after, these early books came out that introduced a generation of Americans to Zen, we now have a whole publication industry, everything from self-help type books, popular books, academic works in philosophy, research and history, and the social sciences. And as I see it, you're kind of coming into this landscape of publications and offering a renewed introduction to Zen for the current generation, for the generation of students that we both teach. Nonetheless, of course, building on the past, and you're engaging your contemporaries. So I'd just like to ask you how you tell us a little bit about how you see your work fitting into this lineage of transmission, this transmission of Zen to America.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wouldn't want to put my book on par with any of the classics of introducing Zen to the West. But it does offer something different, and perhaps unique in that regard. And it very much kind of follows on what we were just talking about. My own personal background is different from the authors of the books that you mentioned. So I guess I would say, if you look at, if you go on Amazon or maybe better to the bookstore, the actual bookstore, right, and you browse books on Zen, you're probably going to find mainly one of two types. Well, actually, I should say serious books on Zen, right? I mean, but there's lots of the, Zen and the art of making up stuff about Zen books out there. And some of those are interesting and helpful and at least cute in their different ways. So, I don't want to say that they're not valuable. But if you look for sort of serious books on Zen, they mainly sort of fall into one of two types. And one type are practice-oriented books. Right, they're usually going to be written by someone who has some kind of authority to teach Zen, and they're going to be very focused on the practice. And the other type of books are the more scholarly books. These are going to be books by folks in religious studies departments or Asian studies departments, and they're going to be usually more focused on the institutions, the history. Often they're going to be trying to sort of make their mark by unearthing something as like, you thought Zen was this, but actually it's this, kind of approaches. And all of both those types are really valuable, and I learn a lot from both of them. But there's actually very few books. If there were more, I would call it a third type of sort of philosophical engagements with Zen. There are sometimes, books and articles like this by philosophers like myself. And those philosophers are sometimes more or sometimes less, but somehow engaged in the practice of Zen. Philosophers seem to be more willing to engage in the practice we have less sort of qualms about that. I think because philosophy is a fundamental, like we're actually looking for the truth of things, right? We're not pretending to have some kind of disengaged objectivity, like it doesn't have to do with my life. Whereas I think some of the scholars in other disciplines, there's still a bit of this. I think of it as kind of a bit of a colonial hangover of like we're not going to get involved with what the natives are doing, but we are going to give the objective account of what they're doing. So it's almost a kind of faux pas, like it would taint your objectivity to actually be seriously engaged in the practice of what you're writing about in some disciplines, sociology and religious studies and so forth. I obviously don't have that qualm, right? I dove in, and for better and for worse, I'm writing out of the experience of both being a philosopher about Zen, but also a practitioner of Zen. So I guess I would situate, I guess that begins to sort of answer your question, that I would situate my book in that lineage of offering that, again, that commute between philosophy and practice. So I don't think it can do the work of these other books. I think there's a place for all kinds of scholarship, as well as more practice-oriented type of books, and even for kind of fun, Zen puppies type books. But I do think what my book offers is something a bit different, and hopefully there's a place for that in the landscape.
Great, thank you. It's a good lead to my next question. My next question is about the ritual side of Zen, but it also takes us, I think, from this earlier generation of writers who were introducing Zen to the American context to newer generations of writers and practitioners and teachers. And in the American context in particular, I've been really inspired by seeing so much leadership in Zen coming from African American women. So I'm thinking here of people like Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, Angel Kyoto Williams, Pamela Ayo Yatunde, Chimio Atkinson, and others. And I'm reading Zenju's new book right now at the same time I've been reading yours. Hers is called The Shamanic Bones of Zen. And she talks a lot about the importance of ritual and ceremony to Zen practice, the importance of honoring ancestors, of being open to fundamental changes in consciousness. And I think maybe it was because I was reading both of your texts at the same time, but I see you both taking a very kindred approach to the heart of Zen practice, the seated meditation, because you both embrace this ceremonial side of the practice, all of the rituals that go into cleansing, honoring, and maintaining the space where practice happens. And because Bret, because of your deep roots in the Zen traditions of Japan, you're familiar with all these sorts of details, and you convey a lot of that sort of wealth of information to readers in the book. And in parts of the book, you respond to this kind of secularized view of mindfulness, the mindfulness movement, which does tend to downplay precisely those ritual or ceremonial aspects of Zen. So my question is sort of how you see this fuller ecosystem of Zen ritual, right? The larger ecosystem surrounding the seated meditation itself. How do you see this ritual ceremonial aspect taking root in an American context? And what do you as a teacher do to further this in your own practices?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a great question in part because it pushes me to say more than I said in the book. I think, in fact, I was waiting to see if you was going to have more of a punch to your question, like if you were going to at one point just shout like, Bret, why didn't you write a 25th chapter on Zen ritual?
Oh, actually, I think it's infused throughout your whole book. There's so much in there, so many details, sort of anecdotes about just what happens in the monastic and in the temple settings surrounding the seated meditation practice itself. So I think it's completely infused throughout the book.
Well, I'm very glad that you picked up on that. I'm very glad that you picked up on that, and not only just Zazen, not just the seated meditation, but all the other practices, walking meditation, chanting. One of my regrets, I have to say, my editor at Oxford, as editors at presses do, was trying to get me to cut it down, to make it shorter. Believe it or not, the manuscript was even longer than the one that's published. And I'm really grateful because publishers do not publish big books these days, and I'm really grateful that he agreed to publish something as big as this one is. But one of the things I cut out, which I think if I had to put one thing back in, it would be this one, is a section on chanting, on the ritual of chanting. And I do have in the Real Zen for Real Life great courses, lectures that I did. In those great courses, I should maybe mention I had I interwove sort of practice sessions in between lectures. So after every second or third lecture, there'd be a practice session where I would introduce what you're talking about, introduce the actual kind of practices. And I do have one, for example, on chanting in there, but it didn't make it into the final book. But also things like samu. Samu is the meditative work that Zen monks and lay practitioners who live in Zen monasteries for periods of time. A lot of what they're doing is manual labor, what we would think of as really kind of hard manual labor, but as an integral part of the practice. So all of these things, chanting, samu, zazen, and on and on. You're absolutely right that they have a very ritualistic aspect to them, and I'm really happy that I didn't have to write the 25th chapter that the publisher wouldn't have let me include anyway, but because at least a reader like you picked up on that interwoven through the text. But I also have to sort of admit that, especially compared to the authors that you mentioned, let me come back maybe to say something about them in a moment. But I don't think it's particularly my forte or my focus to really foreground, as it were, the ritualism. I do appreciate it, and I think there's a whole kind of like ritual is a big topic now in religious studies, and people are sort of really appreciating the importance of ritual. But it's a tricky topic, right? If we for example, it's very difficult to translate the word ritual into Japanese. So what word, in the Zen context would you use? Well, there's a rich vocabulary of words that you would use: gishiki, gire, gyoji, saho. Saho is probably the one that would come first to mind for me. The kind of way you do things, right? And whenever you learn something in the Zen monastery, here's the way you do it. And it's especially so. It's definitely pervasive in Rinzai Zen, which is the school of Zen that I practice in. But even more so, and even more foregrounded and more a kind of central part of the practice in Soto Zen. And all the authors, I believe, that you mentioned belong to Soto Zen, which is much more prevalent in the United States. I think they've done a better job, and it also translates better. So I'm not surprised that the foregrounding of the ritualistic aspects there. Dogen, for example, the 13th century founder of the Japanese school of Soto Zen, he has a saying that's attributed to him that kind of, when people say, what is Soto Zen? Well, they sometimes quote Dogen says, Igi soku buppo saho kore shushi, which can be translated as dignified decorum is the Buddha Dharma. And then here's that word saho, ritual action is the main teaching, is the main point. So there you have it, right? There's your quote for your question. And absolutely, and Dogen is not only one of the most philosophically astute and rich authors in the Zen tradition, probably the most, but he's also really emphasizes the ritual, and he has detailed in his monastic guidelines, detailed instructions for your behavior, from everything from the dinner table to the bathroom, to the toilet and the bathroom, literally. So I think that it's very. I think what authors like, and I have read some of them. I need to read more, but I recently did read the Shamanic Bones of Zen by Zenju Earthly Manuals, and I think what she's doing is really interesting because on the one hand, she's deeply connected with and rooted in the Zen tradition, the Soto Zen tradition, especially, as I said, going back to Dogen. I'll have to write her and tell her, she maybe knows it, but this saying really could be on the cover of her book. But on the other hand, she's really provocative, and she's connecting this with a much wider field of shamanic practices in Africa and the Americas and so forth. And so she's really sort of appealing to Zen practitioners in the West, is to wake up to the depth of this, not the philosophical orientation, but rather the ritualistic embodied, the sort of transcending of the intellect, something that you have to get through embodied, ritualistic, repeated practice. So I think that what she's doing is fascinating, important. What the other authors you mentioned are doing is fascinating, important, and they're really, I think, in addressing head-on these very stubborn systemic problems we have in our society with racism, sexism, and so forth. That they're really writing a new chapter in the history of Zen, a distinctively American 21st century black feminist chapter in the history of Zen Buddhism. And so I look forward to, even though my own sort of background and orientation, philosophical orientation, is somewhat different, but I look forward to continuing to learn from the chapter that they are living and writing.
That's great. That's another great lead to my next question too, because it's interesting for me to reflect on the different modes in which Zen has been transmitted into the American context. And like you, I'm very inspired by a lot of the teachers who are on the scene right now, including you and including your book in that context. And so this might be an expansion on the question about ritual, but I'm also very interested in the institutional side of Zen in America, especially because that's such an interesting contrast with what we might consider kind of an anti-institutional approach to Zen in the early years of its appropriation here, right, in the American context. We have Zen centers in any number of American cities right now. And I guess these are technically what we would call Zen temples in a Japanese context, but they function quite differently in the United States landscape than they do in Japan. And I think that speaks to the fact that for some time now, Zen institutions in America are negotiating their identities in terms of what they build on from Japanese precedents, and what they're developing newly, right, within the US context. And given that I do see your work as part of this lineage of transmission, I'm very curious, having put this book forward, with all the detail that it has for both scholars and learners and practitioners, what direction you are interested in taking Zen institutional structures, or seeing Zen institutional structures go in the US in the future?
Wow, yeah. So yeah, another good question is pushing me to say more than I did in the book. You're nicely pushing me out of my comfort zone, I would say, with these questions about ritual and institution, which in many ways are not my, I think strong points. But I would start by saying I would not presume to tell the many different institutions, Zen institutions we have in the United States and elsewhere, the direction that they should take. I think you're definitely right. I mean, everyone's still trying to figure this out, and I think that's a good thing. I think once people start thinking they have it figured out, I think that's probably not going to be good. And we have to remind ourselves, it took 500 years of Buddhism being transplanted to China before really sort of distinctively coherent, Chinese Buddhism came about, and Zen in particular, but also other forms of Chinese Buddhism. So we're only less than 100 years in, so to speak. And I think that we also have to be sort of careful because, we have such kind of political, economic, cultural clout, right? And I think, Americans in particular, by which I mean U.S. Americans in particular, have a tendency towards a kind of colonial arrogance in that way of like, we're going to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, and here's what the good stuff is, and that kind of confidence easily leads to a kind of arrogance there. So I think we need a lot more time to figure it out. I think we need to keep trying to figure it out. I think different institutions trying to figure it out differently is a good thing. We can sort of learn from each other. But I also would say, you're putting me on the spot. Sort of, what about you? I think I feel, oddly, I feel most comfortable being uncomfortable, I would say. Maybe this is the philosopher in me as well as the Zen practitioner. When Socrates referred to himself as atopos, without place, and I connect that to this idea of being a commuter. So I'm not really sort of interested in founding an institution that would house both philosophy and practice. I'm more comfortable with allowing the sort of integrity of each one of those to be what it is, to relate them without conflating them, is the way I put it in the book. I want to relate philosophy and academic philosophy and Zen practice without conflating them. And I really get that from my own teacher, Ueda Sensei, and the lineage of the Kyoto School, which never, they would never sort of conflated the two, but did commute between and relate the two. So my own sort of positioning in this, I think, is that being a go-between, being a commuter, and contributing what I can. Sometimes I get asked to do a guest Dharma talk at a Zen center or an institution. More often, I'm trying to work from within academia to try to open up academic philosophy to the philosophy, if not also the practice of Zen. As you know, and institutions like we have, like the Comparative and Continental Philosophy Circle, the CCPC, that we just met in Tallinn a week ago. It's an academic philosophy conference, but it's one with people who are open to testing kind of the limits as well as the power of philosophical thinking, and bringing philosophy into relation with extra philosophical practices and activities like art, but also like meditation and so forth. So institution, I think I work from within academia, opening it up, both in the teaching engagement I do with students that I've talked about, but also then on the professional level in societies like that. I do sometimes lead. The pandemic has put a halt to this for the moment, but we're planning one for next year. Something I call a Kozen Symposium, which is a kind of practice study retreat. I'm lucky enough to have a brother and his wife run a beautiful little rustic retreat center down in Panama, and so we use that retreat center and go back and forth between philosophically talking about texts and practicing Zazen and other embodied spiritual practices. So I guess that would be the one place where I kind of do that. But that's not something I'm trying to build like a whole kind of institution on. It's something I'm inviting sort of like-minded people to cooperatively sort of do that activity. Was there another part of your, maybe, did that address your question?
It does, and I'm going to turn it over to audience Q&A here in a second. But I will say it's funny. I'm glad you thought my questions were challenging, but I actually wasn't trying to push you out of a comfort zone at all. And I think, I do think your voice here is important in the institutional context. You've mentioned issues of colonialism and Eurocentrism quite a few times today. And I think voices like yours that are savvy to those kinds of issues, that resist those kinds of colonial dynamics that we're both concerned with. I think your voice as an institutional leader and as an institutional insider is important. So that was sort of my motivation for wondering how you think broadly, right, about the future of Zen. And what it looks like from your perspective. So I'm going to, I know we're—
Actually, let me, before you take the question, it was one plug that I should put in for a newly founded society that we're planning, actually, the first meeting of the International Society for Contemplative Research, the ISCR. And this is going to, the first meeting will be next February in San Diego. But what's really interesting about this society is that it's not just, this society's really pushing me out of my comfort zone, because it's not just trying to relate without conflating philosophy and Zen, but actually not just Zen, but much more broadly contemplative practices relating it to different areas of science, including the social sciences and neurobiology and so forth, as well as anthropology, religious studies, and philosophy. So trying to get practitioners, but to talk to all of these, engage in dialogue with all these different disciplines, and trying to get an interdisciplinary dialogue going is going to be very challenging, but also really exciting, and I think much needed in our times.
Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure the audience has time for questions here too. We have quite a long line, so I apologize already if we don't get through all of these. But I'll start. I'm going to start with one that I think picks up maybe on some of the dynamics we've been talking about just now with Zen as it kind of moves around the world. This is from Phil Chan. Although Chan Buddhism began in China, but it did not establish the strong roots as Zen in Japan. What do you see as the cultural differences between China and Japan that can explain the rootedness in Japanese culture?
Wow, yeah, that's a big question, and maybe one that probably a historian could of Zen and Chan could answer better than I could. Yes, I mean, Chan certainly established deep, very influential roots for centuries in China.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, in the 13th century, was transplanted to Japan, but of course didn't simply go away in China. In China, it was much more. In Japan, the different Buddhist traditions became much more distinct, right? So you had Zen temples and Pure Land Buddhist temples,
Mm-hmm.
whereas in China there was still a much more fluid relation between these different forms of Buddhist practice. And so that's one sort of distinction there. But then, what exactly happened to Chan after the 13th century going forward is a long and sort of difficult history that's not one that I would be the best person to ask about. But it is a fascinating question. And then fast forward, of course, now to the 20th and then 21st centuries, and especially in mainland China now. I mean, they've had a kind of politically rough road in the 20th century, and the status, right? The Cultural Revolution, where the really strong, political suppression of all forms of religious practice, the destruction of temples and whatnot. There really is kind of a lost generation or two in the transmission there. And so now, in China, but then also places that didn't have that, like Taiwan and elsewhere. So there's really a lot of sort of rich, different traditions and how they weathered that storm, and how now, like so many things, the different Buddhist traditions is really in the 20th century, starting in the late 19th, but really in the 20th century, that for the first time in many, many centuries, you have these different Buddhist traditions meeting each other again.
Mm-hmm.
And so this age of not just inter-religious dialogue, but you could say intra-religious dialogue, where they're all Buddhism, but many different Buddhisms, and that dialogue is fascinating. If you ever go to Bodh Gaya, Bodh Gaya is the place where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and attained enlightenment. If you go there, it's fascinating because they have all different temples from all the different Buddhist countries have been built, all in the 20th century. This is a new thing. And so side by side, for the first time in centuries, you have side by side these different Buddhist traditions and the kind of opportunity to start to have this dialogue between them. But I also think that places like the United States are becoming a forum for that dialogue, because a lot of the people listening to this, or a lot of people maybe reading the book, are interested in Tibetan Buddhism and also Sri Lankan Theravada Buddhism or Thai Theravada Buddhism, and we don't have these absolute lines between them. We might go to one meeting one week and another the next week, but those traditions themselves developed independently for centuries and centuries, and so for better and for worse, kind of for superficial worse, but also for dialogical better, in places like the United States. These different traditions are coming into contact with each other, not just through dialogue, but also through diapraxis, right? Actually having people engaging in these different practices. So that's sort of fascinating and filled with problems, but also possibilities.
Yeah, I like that term, diapraxis. That's good. This next question that I'll pick, I think maybe is a more philosophical or even sort of personal twist on the question we just had. This is from an anonymous attendee who says, can you speak about the power of Zen Buddhism to be sensitive to the context and situation in which we find ourselves? Can it teach us to see what is required in a given lived situation and how to respond appropriately?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think what it can teach us, especially as in practice, right? So not the philosophy, but really the practice here. What it can teach us is the opposite of handing you some manual of action, right? Like, oh, here's what you should do, right? Here are the principles by which you should act, or here's the rules of behavior. What it has to offer is something very different from that, which is actually to be there and to be open, and to be attentive, and to be aware of all the different factors coming into play in a given situation. And so it's that practice of opening yourself, you could say, that's at the core of the practice. So there's many different types of meditation, but Zen meditation is not about it's not a contemplation of a doctrine. You're not reciting a prayer or even a mantra. It's very much it's the opposite of a guided meditation. I tell people, people want to show up and have a guided meditation. I say, no, this is the opposite of that. I tell everyone wants to sort of gain something, right? So they come to the practice session. It's like, well, what am I going to get out of this? I went to this other club meeting and I got this, and I went to this class and I got this. I did this other activity, this internship, and I got this, learned this skill and this and that. And then they come to a Zen meeting. Okay, what does this have to offer me? What is this going to do for me? And I tell them, nothing. Zen is sometimes said is good for nothing. And I tell them, I say, I hope that you leave each meditation meeting with less, not more, than you came in with. But what I mean by that, of course, is less of our agendas, less of our preconceptions, less of our prejudices, right? I mean, prejudices in the broad sense, right? The Gadamer sense of all of the prejudgments that we bring to a situation. So this question, I think, is asking about that, right? It's not going to give you a different set of prejudgments, right? Let's say, non-racist ones instead of racist ones, right? And it's certainly not going to voice the former, but it's also not going to try to dislodge that by giving you a different set of firm beliefs that then you can go and shout and try to get other people to believe in. It's rather going to open you to what are the various forces at play here, and how can I then intervene in the most effective way to push the needle in a more compassionate direction.
Yeah, that is one thing I find sort of sad when dealing with my own students in the limited context in which I've introduced them to any meditation practice, is how anxious it makes them to do anything without an agenda, right? And even sometimes I'll say, look, I'm giving you credit for this, if that helps, right? This is still, goal oriented. If that helps you do it, just remember you are getting rewarded. But yeah, the idea of just sitting without knowing exactly what they're supposed to get out of it or why or what it's for is anxiety proof. And I find that sort of sad that they're so driven, right? They're just so their days are so regimented and their time is so goal oriented that it's really hard for them to just sort of sit and be for a little bit.
But I would say, though, adding to what you just said, I would say that becoming aware of that anxiety, aware of that obsession about immediate goals and so forth, that's huge, I think. So for them to sit and have that, so that's why I tell them, I hope. The other thing I like to say to them at the end of their first meditation meeting is, I hope you had a terrible time. Yeah. But I really mean that. I really mean that, because if you're not opening to with the problem, it's not an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting exactly, but if we're not admitting right? That we're addicted to mind candy, we're addicted to our own anxieties and our own ruminations and so forth, then why would you be motivated to meditate, right? If you don't realize there's a problem here that needs to be addressed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe that's a good lead. There's one question here that I feel like could be a trick question or not. It's from Christine Ellis. It says, is there a core teaching of Zen?
Yeah, I think it's a good, I mean, connected to the previous one.
Mhm.
So if you're looking for a core doctrine, then I would say no. But if you take the word core literally, meaning heart, which in Chinese and Japanese is the heart mind, then that's the core, right? Coming to really know your own heart mind. And that heart mind, as I say, I think in the second chapter, right? What you discover at the core of yourself is an openness to the outside. So what you discover when you go all the way in is an openness to the outside. So if you're looking for sort of a core, like here's I don't know why, but I like to call it the golden golf ball idea, that somehow like deep down in me I'm going to find this precious, my authentic self.
Mhm.
Then no, it's precisely the not finding anything, right? The nothingness, the openness, the emptiness. That's the core. But that's an experience, not a doctrine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Anthony's told me I can go a little bit over the hour here. We have really two questions still pending. So I'll read them both to you and sort of let you take it where you will here at the end. One of them is asking directly, how would you describe or explain contemporary Buddhism? And the other one is asking you a comparative question. So this is from David Mark Larson, the first from Elka Anola. The second one here, a short, somewhat complex question. How would you describe the similarities and differences between the self and Zen Buddhist philosophy compared to Heidegger's Dasein? So I will let you consider the question of contemporary Buddhism or the comparative, dimension of your own work with Heidegger, as you will here for the last question.
Okay, good. And so I have about 45 minutes to answer each of those questions, right? Let me see. The first question, I'm not sure what it's asking about contemporary Buddhism, but let me answer it this way. Hopefully this is what it's asking about. So people often talk about Buddhist modernism. And that's a really interesting, that it filled many volumes, that people like to talk about what, modern, especially modern Westerners, but not only Westerners, also in Asia, but under the influence usually of the Western tradition, especially the Western tradition since the Enlightenment, have really kind of reinterpreted and in some cases distorted, according to the critics, especially, really distorted the nature of these traditions. And one of the ways is, for example, to go back to your earlier question, taking out the ritual, right? Taking out this. So we end up with a kind of sort of mindfulness practices where this is the essence. We don't need all of the mumbo jumbo accessories. And so that's often called kind of Buddhist modernism. And so in the first chapter of the book, I take on that question, because I think for some readers, certainly some scholars, are going to see my book as another chapter in the history of Buddhist modernism. And in some ways, I'm okay with that, because I think Buddhism has always needed to be contemporary. If it's not contemporary, it's not really Buddhism, right? Then it's something in a history museum or something. So real, Zen has to be about our real life, to quote the lecture course series title. Real Zen has to be about our real lives, and our real lives are modern or contemporary. And for those of us living in the United States, they're lives in the United States. So Zen has to be related to the here and now of our lives, or else it's not Zen. It's not what Zen has ever been, because Zen has always been about the here and now, wherever that here and now might be. But that being said, I do think that we have to sort of critically, we do have to appropriate these traditions. We have to make them our own. In that sense, I know cultural appropriation is a bad word now, but we do have to sort of, if you take something seriously, you make it your own. which also means you're letting it remake you. You're not just remaking it; it's remaking you. So that's to sort of take it seriously, but that also has to be not just a critical, but also creative process, critical and creative. So we do need to think about how are we, distorting the tradition when we don't take its ritual seriously, for example, your question. And also then, right, we tie both of these to the Shamanic Bones of Zen book, right? How can we both recover something that's been lost in Buddhist modernism, but also add something new, right? I mean, to bring it into conversation with other shamanic traditions in that case, but also to address issues of racism and so forth in our own society, which Zen has never had those exact questions asked of it. So that's how I'd answer the first question, is that I think this is really what the first chapter of my book is about, is that I think Zen has to be about the here and now, but that has to be a critical and creative sort of process of appropriation. And there's all kind of ways in which it can kind of go wrong, but also many fruitful ways in which it can go right. The second question, oh boy, this is the tough philosophical question, and since I have my first book was on Heidegger, and I was actually finishing that book when I was living in Japan, and I found that it was much easier for me to talk about the things I was really interested in Heidegger, especially the problem of the will and notion of Gelassenheit. It was much easier to talk about that with my Japanese colleagues than it was with my American colleagues. And so I found that really interesting. Of course, I was already deeply involved in Zen practice at that point, so I think my way of reading Heidegger was already sort of influenced from that direction. But I do think there's some differences, and let me mention two very, very sort of briefly. In my book Heidegger and the Will, I have a short section of a chapter called, let's see if I can remember the title of that section now, From Being Towards Death to the Great Death, an exhortation from Zen. And I think what Heidegger, the early Heidegger now we're talking about, what he talks about is being towards death. I think the Zen response to that is you got to go all the way. And so Zen talks about undergoing the great death. And I think that's can be understood in the direction that Heidegger is going, but it's a step further. It's a step further that sort of changes everything in a way. So if you want to know more about that, read the section in that book, Heidegger and the Will. The second thing I'd like to say, because I was just reading about this morning, my ongoing reading and study of Ueda Shizuteru. This is the final volume in his collected works, volume 11, I guess 11, and it's called "What is Religion? Shukyo to wa Nanika." And his main sort of philosophy is he borrows Heidegger's phrase, "being in the world," but he says again we need to go one step further, and he reformulates that as being in the twofold world. Niju sekai nai sonzai is his Japanese phrase for that. And his sort of, again, Zen sort of understanding, or re-articulation of this is that we're always being in the world now being that context of meaning, that totality of significance, as Heidegger talks about. Right? So everything is useful as something. Everything has an as structure. We're constantly living in this web of meanings, you could say. The world for us is this web of meanings. But Ueda's point is that web of meanings is always situated in turn within a more open expanse. And he uses a traditional Buddhist term for this open expanse called the koku in Japanese. Now, he recognizes that Heidegger, the later Heidegger, also talks about, in fact, in the book that I translated by Heidegger called Country Path Conversations, Heidegger talks about the horizon, right, that horizontal world of meanings that we live in, is always situated within what he calls the Gegnit, which I translate as the open region. And so I think a fruitful kind of comparison with Ueda's Zen philosophy and Heidegger's later philosophy, especially in country path conversations and elsewhere, is between this idea of the open region in which our human horizons, our human worlds of meaning are situated, and what Ueda talks about as the twofold world.